Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, the little things that aid in immersion. In the wilds, the Nightwalker. And in the Tavern, what would you do if there was a royal wedding? How's it going, everyone? Excited to talk a little bit about immersion today. We're going to go over 5 little things that each one of us can add to our games which just help us a little bit in staying immersed in the story at the table. Before we get into that, though, just a few announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Subscribe to us on YouTube if you'd like to get the podcast that way. We would also really appreciate it if you would rate the podcast wherever you listen. It helps spread the word to more and more people about the podcast. And finally, it would be awesome of you to support us on Patreon. There's lots of awesome perks up there for our patrons, especially all the homebrew information for our setting of Carrick. And coming up in just a couple of weeks, we're going to be releasing the Ichmaset race, a custom race based in our world of Carrick, which you can use in any of your 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons settings. You can find right now the title page of that document with some great art by Devin Simons. You can find his work on Twitter at DevMakesThings. He did all the amazing art for the piece. And we're excited to bring you a product with a professional layout. We hope you all enjoy, and again, it's going to be available on our Patreon in a couple of weeks. But however you support us, your support is very much appreciated. Your sharing of the podcast, your rating of the podcast, your support of us on Patreon, it all encourages us and it helps us make this podcast even better for you each and every day. But with that out of the way, immersion. Now, when I say immersion, within the context of Dungeons & Dragons and other TTRPGs, what we're talking about is full engagement in the story. We're talking about where you're not struggling with going in and out of the story. You are there. You are in the narrative. You are in the role-playing. You are immersed. But it can be hard to stay immersed. It can be hard to exercise our imagination completely in that way. It can be hard to get lost in our character's head, to be lost in the setting, to be lost in our environment, to fully engage with the DM's description, or be fully engaged with the player's mindset, what they're doing if we happen to be the DM. It's a challenge that we all face in and at the table. But it's often those moments where we are fully immersed, where we have the most beautiful and memorable moments of role-playing. Those moments where we look back on years later and we can just tell wonderful stories of just how awesome this felt and how it felt to be in this moment, to be fully immersed in this narrative. And there are lots of factors which aid in immersion, and we're not going to be doing anywhere near an exhaustive conversation today. But what we want to do today is just talk about 5 little things that can help with that. And these things will vary by table. For some, all 5 of these things would work beautifully. For some others, depending on their situation, some or all of them might not be things which work for them. Again, as we always say here on the podcast, this is about everybody growing, including us, to be able to tell the best collaborative story that we can. And if some of these things work for you, great. If they don't, I hope it provides a little starting off point to find other little things which might aid in immersion in your games. So don't think that the 5 things we're going to be covering today are hard and fast rules. They're not. But you might find that they help a little bit with immersion at your tables. The 5 things we're going to be looking at are random encounters, and I'll explain what I mean about that going forward a little bit, because I don't mean what we typically think of when we think of the word random encounters, but there's random encounters. Secondly, there's spell components. Third, describing combat actions. 4, props. And 5, subtle connections to past events. So we're just going to dive right in and go through these 5 little things which can aid in immersion. First, random encounters. So what do I mean by random encounters? When we hear that word, I think we're conditioned a little bit to think primarily of just combat encounters. But when I say random encounters, I mean anything that we pass as we're playing at the table that is out of the ordinary. Take traveling through the wilderness, for example. A random encounter could be an attack. It could be a bandit ambush or a wild animal attack as you pass through, or the same thing happening while you're taking watch at night. That could be a random encounter, but it could also be other things. It could be a caravan that you pass by. It could be coming across a landmark, like a shack or an old campsite or a broken and defaced statue. It could be coming across a non-threatening group of creatures, like deer or something like a unicorn. It could be encountering animal tracks of some description. All these things are random encounters. They are things that the party comes across which are out of the norm and may or may not warrant a response. You know, oftentimes, again, with random encounters, we're thinking of something that warrants a response. You know, it's a combat encounter or it's a social encounter. It's something where somebody comes up to you and either you're expected to fight them or you're expected to interact in some way. But random encounters can really give you a great sense of immersion when you just think about anything which happens, which is out of the norm. In my own games, it's really easy to want to push the plot along, to just get from one place to the next, to fast travel, if you will, just like you do in Skyrim or something like that. And that's perfectly fine. It's necessary at times. There's no need to have something unique at every walk to the store. But having random things occur gives a great sense of immersion. Again, it doesn't have to be anything that the party responds to. The DM can just note a random event or a random sighting that the group is experiencing as they walk. And as a player, you can note in a single sentence what your character is doing on this trek. What stuff like this does is it makes the world feel real. When we play, we aren't fast traveling to a destination. Our characters are physically walking or physically going at least to a place where they can teleport or something like that. They're doing things. They're passing things. They're walking through the woods. They're walking through the fields. They're walking along the road. There's things that they're encountering, and adding in brief little details helps make the world feel very real. It doesn't have to be much. Again, these are all little things you can do. All these things that we're going to be talking about today are things you can do in 1 or max of 2 sentences in your own descriptions, which could just add to the sense of realism and thus a greater sense of immersion. Let's go back to the traveling in the wilderness scenario. Throw in a caravan. The party is traveling down the road, and a merchant caravan just is passing you going the other way. Perhaps they can trade with the party, perhaps not, but there's no need for an engagement, but it made the world feel realer. Why? Because the party aren't the only people on a wilderness road. They aren't the only people traveling from this location to this other location. There is other people. Plus, it lets you tell something and build out the world. Are they traveling from the city the party's trying to go to? Are they people clearly who are destitute, or people clearly who are wealthy? Are they people from another region where you can tell based on their garb or their mannerisms, where you can see different cultural behaviors and you could tell they're from another region? What kind of wares do they have? All these little things you can add in, and it builds out the world with just subtle descriptions. If they are from another region, well, now you've just established in that 2-sentence description of them passing a caravan that there's commerce that goes on between these two neighboring factions. And it's built something in your world, in addition to giving a sense of realism that your party is just walking down the road and passing people just like they normally would. It all makes it feel more real. You get that sense of realness, that sense of interconnectedness. It makes it feel lived in. Well, what if a party comes across something like tracks? It will tell them something about the wildlife. It will tell them something about whether or not there's something to be wary of. It will give them more information, and it will just make the world feel more lived in. What if, in the exploration of a town, instead of just rolling an investigation check and ending up at your destination, take a couple of seconds to describe what is there as you're looking around, trying to figure out where this place is that you're trying to go, as you're trying to find the magic shop, looking for potions or something like that. You take a couple of seconds as a DM and describe what's there. It tells you something and immerses you in the story. Describe the temples they passed. Often we only really describe temples of the deities that the party interacts with, whichever one, the cleric or whatever other divine-based spellcasters you happen to have. They really only talk about the ones that the party interacts with. But there's so many other deities out there in most settings. And including that in your description can tell players what's important to people in this region. Is the temple of one god large and well kept, while another is small and run down? And that tells them something. It communicates information, and that aids with immersion. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying you need to go on a 5-minute exposition at every opportunity, because there is a such thing as information overload. If you give the party too much information, they won't know what to act on, or they can try to act on everything, and it'll lead to all sorts of problems. The players will instinctively think they're supposed to stop and follow through on that description. If you describe something like this just for world context, flavor, and immersion, and that goes on for too long, the players will just stop at every opportunity, and it will really bog down the plot. But when you're describing the party's trek to a location, just include, again, 1 or 2 extra sentences of detail. That little extra bit of environmental description goes a long way. And be specific with that detail too. It helps a lot more to be specific with what they see. Don't just note that there seems to be many impoverished people in this area of the city, for example. That's good. That adds flavor to your world. It tells them something, and it tells them what they're experiencing as they're traveling to the blacksmith. But real immersion, in my opinion, comes with those little details. Instead of just saying that they see impoverished people, note that they see specifically several homeless people huddled around a fire. Note that they see a small, dirty child that comes up and asks for coin. Little specific interactions where they see specific people and can imagine specific faces. And these little specifics, these little details, both tell your party that there's a lot of poverty without actually just explicitly saying it. And it goes even further than that with these extra details that immerse your players in that situation. So again, add random encounters. Just add 1 or 2 sentences to your descriptions of just what the players are experiencing that's just out of the norm. The second thing we wanted to go over is spell components. Spell components are one of those things that we don't like to think about. For somatic components, we don't really think about our hand motions or the required movements we make unless our hands are restrained and we have to think about it. We don't think about the verbal components unless similarly we're restrained with a gag or something like that, or we're in an area that's affected by a silence spell. For material components, we buy a component pouch or even an arcane focus, and we just assume that we have what we need to cast our spells, unless it's a specific component that is consumed by the spell, and we have to constantly buy more and more in order to keep casting the spell. And honestly, this is fine. There's not much need of it mechanically outside of those small subset of situations. But for immersion, we miss a little flavor opportunity here if we never considered this. Again, it's not much. It's just a little thing. It's just a brief description of what you're doing with the spell components when you cast a spell. Instead of just saying, I cast Barkskin, for example. Say, I reach into my pouch, pull out a couple of pieces of oak bark, chanting under my breath, and wave my free hand around the bark to cast Barkskin on myself. A quick one-sentence additive, which just adds a little bit of flavor, puts a mental picture in the DM's mind and the other player's mind that gives a little greater sense of immersion. Instead of, I cast Confusion, say, I reach out with my wand, muttering incantations, and erratic, sickly green energy shoots from its tip and towards the area, casting Confusion. Instead of, I cast Enlarge on myself, say, I grab some metallic dust from my pouch, fling it into the air, step forward and inhale it deeply as I chant, casting Enlarge on myself. These are all simple, one-sentence descriptors. But to me, they set the mental scene really well. It helps with immersion to me because I can imagine better what my character is doing or see in my mind's eye what another character is doing better than I can without that description. Some people even go beyond this with regards to verbal and somatic components and actually devise a specific quick sequence of words or hand gestures that they use for each particular spell. Personally, I don't do this. That's a lot of work. But if that would help immerse you into the story better, go for it. The big thing with this, though, is, again, it's just a little thing you can do, a little one-sentence thing you could add into your descriptions, which aid in your immersion. It doesn't take long to do, and it puts a mental image into your fellow player's head instead of putting the mental image of the player's handbook into their head, which is often whenever someone just says, I cast a spell, I think of specifically the effects of the spell, and I try to picture and remember exactly what that spell does. And there will always be some of that, but what a greater sense of immersion whenever there's a brilliant one-sentence description of what the character is doing and what my character is seeing as the spell is going into effect. Similarly, we can also increase immersion via the third thing, descriptions in combat. Just like with spells, when you go to make a combat maneuver, when you go to make an attack roll, describe what you do in one sentence of detail. Instead of, I shoot at it with an arrow, say, I spin around swiftly as I pull an arrow from my quiver, drop to one knee, and loose the arrow at the monster. Instead of the monk saying, I punch it twice, you could say, I swing with a hard right cross and follow up with a swift left uppercut to his jaw. Instead of, I hit it with my sword, you could say, with a flourish, I brandish my longsword and attempt to slash across his torso through his defenses. Again, this is very much just like describing what you're doing with your spell components. You're adding a quick sentence of detail that gives a vivid and immersive mental picture of the circumstance. And of course, after the attack comes the attack roll, and there's immersion opportunities there as well for the DM. The DM can describe what happens. And as players, we should let them do it too. Sometimes we roll really low. We roll like a 2 plus 5 at lower levels, and we're like, oh, that misses. Well, maybe it didn't just miss. Maybe the DM could use it as an opportunity to add some descriptors. Some descriptors which not only aid in immersion, but they also maybe give you some information you can use in the combat. What if instead of just saying it missed, they take the opportunity to describe the thick natural hide of the creature, how your attack hit, but it just glanced off of its scaly armor. And that description of how your blow just glanced off tells you something about that creature. Perhaps the creature is very quick, and the DM uses the opportunity to describe your miss with how it dodges out of the way with great speed. Let the DM describe it whenever this happens, and let them immerse you into the story. And as a DM, take those opportunities. It really does immerse your players. Not only by giving the description, but it gets the players deeper into the collaborative narrative by giving them something to react to. If you describe how it deftly dodges out of the way and moves with great haste, maybe that gives the characters a hint that maybe a spell with a dexterity-based saving throw is less likely to succeed than one that has a wisdom-based saving throw. And of course, the same thing can be done by using vivid description of the way that a party's successful attacks land. Just like with misses, good description with successful attacks can really aid in that immersion. Another way to increase immersion as a DM in combat is to describe the actions of other characters as the acting player completes his turn. Time can get a little wibbly-wobbly, to quote Doctor Who, in combat, can't it? An entire round, an entire cycle of turns is supposed to last 6 seconds, but everyone's turn mechanically happens in isolation. And that makes it feel strange because it makes everyone feel like they're standing still while one person acts. And to a certain extent, it's hard to avoid that in any turn-based combat system. And unfortunately, one of the things that this can do is decrease that immersion. It can take you out of your role-playing as you focus on the mechanics. But as a DM, one way to mitigate this as best as we can is to connect the player's actions as you describe the results of combat. So whenever player 2 in the initiative order completes a successful attack on the creature, describe exactly how it followed up on the actions of player 1. Again, just one sentence. Just add something in there that connects the two actions, that makes it feel like it's all one flowing thing that's happening right after another. It's never going to be perfect. It's still a turn-based combat system, and I'm personally not smart nor knowledgeable enough to really figure out exactly the best way of handling that. But doing those little descriptors that connect the player's actions, and players connecting your actions as you describe what you do in 1 or 2 sentences, describing how you're reacting to what the previous couple of players did or what the monster just did, that can add to the sense of immersion of not only you, but the entire table. The fourth little thing which aids with immersion is props. Now, we usually think of physical things when we think of props, and I think if you probably looked up the definition of props, that probably literally is part of the definition, but it doesn't have to be in the way that I'm using this right here. So many D&D games are run online now anyways, and of course, almost all of them are right now during this period of the COVID-19 quarantine. But even if you're just showing the party something visually as a DM, like a puzzle or an object, props can aid in immersion. Having a thing that the party can visually see, or even if you're in person, physically manipulate, is much more powerful than simply describing a puzzle or an object. They don't have to use their imagination as much. It's right there. That's really the whole concept behind minis. And there's just something about having even paper rings that you are getting to spin around, or that you as a DM are spinning around for the camera for the group online, instead of just describing the glyphs that they're trying to align. One of the favorite games that I've ever run, which was not a Dungeons & Dragons game, was a Call of Cthulhu game. For those of you who aren't aware, Call of Cthulhu is a D100 system, which is based on Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and we ran a one-shot that was set during the Great Chicago Fire, essentially the concept being that a Lovecraftian monster was what caused the Great Chicago Fire. But during the course of that game, each player had a physical prop that they found that they got to use within the game. I found that really helped with immersion. The doctor got a pill bottle with these crushed up things, which he figured out he could give to the fellow players to help with their sanity checks. The archaeologist character had this stone slab which was carved with this sort of rune. The carriage driver had a deck of cards that had a little bit of blood on it, which had been left behind by a key person in the story. And being able to physically handle those things, or again, if you're online, being able to see pictures, being able to have visual things that you can look at and imagine and put in that situation, it really helps with immersion. This, of course, is harder online than it is in person, but I'm a big believer that even if you can just see something, it helps fill out your imagination and give better immersion. The final thing that we wanted to discuss is connection to past events. This might sound a little strange because, of course, events are connected. We're in a campaign, Samuel. Of course, this session connects to last session, which connects to our first session as a party a year ago. Of course it connects. But what I mean is specific, little detailed connections which show the party that the world is real. Whenever a town gets attacked and they go back a couple of months later and visit it, throw in a little detail about a couple of buildings being under construction from whatever event happened to occur a couple of months ago in the story. If a particular NPC had gone missing, perhaps they come across some missing posters or something like that, even in a different town. Throw in little one-sentence details which call back previous events and show that the world is real, that the world is recovering or reacting or adjusting to previous events. This can go for physical things like the examples that we just discussed. It can go for interactions with NPCs where different relationships that they've built continue to be affected and grow as time goes on. The specific shopkeep that they happen to keep visiting is giving them some more discount, is greeting them differently whenever they come in, is sharing their name to other people, maybe giving them some extra information. There's all sorts of little things you can do which connect to past events. And whenever that happens, I think it aids in immersion because it, again, makes the world feel real. It makes it feel lived in. It makes it feel like the characters' decisions matter. It makes it feel like whatever thing you happen to be discussing that happened in the past is brought up again in your character's mind in the present. Was it something that negatively or positively affected the characters in their emotional state? Well, it brings up that situation again. It connects everything together and it makes it feel real. And when things feel real, it aids in immersion. You can also even more simply do this with just a recurring NPC. Having just an NPC pop up in a different city or in a different town can add some intrigue, create an interesting encounter opportunity, an interesting social encounter. and just make the world feel real, because the characters do move around. They don't move in set patterns. They travel for business. They travel to and from the tavern. They don't just stay in their shop 24/7. And adding in recurring NPCs in areas where you don't expect, again, aids with immersion. But these 5 little things, random encounters, spell components, describing your combat actions, props, and little connections to the past, all of these things, if you just take one sentence to just add in a little descriptor, it can aid with the immersion in the collaborative narrative. And we'd love to hear from you out there in the Plot Hooks family. What little things have you experienced at your tables that either you've done or a fellow PC has done, or that your DM has done, or that your players have done? What things have you seen which have really aided in immersion? Little things that anybody can add in to their game. Contact us on all of our social media. Start the conversation. After all, this podcast is all about telling the best collaborative stories that we can. And if we can all figure out a way to better immerse ourselves in the narrative, we'll all be better for it. But I think that's just about all the time we have in the Prime material. Let's head over to the wilds and talk about some Nightwalkers. Here in the wilderness. Today we're going to be looking at the Nightwalker. Nightwalkers are extremely powerful entities of anti-life. They're from what's called the negative plane. And if you're familiar at all with DC Comics and the character Darkseid, who primarily interacts with Superman, that entity has a quest for what is called in the DC continuity the anti-life equation. And in some ways, that equation would be embodied by D&D's negative plane. It is a place of anti-life, a place where life is disintegrated. It is nothing but darkness, death, and void. The lore states that the negative plane is reachable via the Shadowfell, just like you can cross into the Shadowfell from the Prime material at places where the barriers between those two overlap because of the similarities. You can then cross from the Shadowfell into the negative plane in the same general way, where you're in a place that's especially dark and terrible for the Shadowfell. Personally, though, I don't think it has to be connected directly with the Shadowfell. If you want to make it part of a Shadowfell adventure, you can, but I don't think it necessarily has to be connected with that. You can connect it to the Prime material in the same sort of terrible, dark places. That way you don't have to feel like you introduce an entirely new place in the Shadowfell just to get to where you want to go in the negative plane. You can just introduce the negative plane directly into where the party is in the Prime material. Despite its dangers, there are people, like with all powerful things, who want to tap into this power for their own nefarious means. They're the D&D dark side, so to speak. Most of the time, when people try to interact with the plane, they just get annihilated and their story ends. Thus, the nature of the anti-life of the negative plane. But sometimes, those individuals are instead sucked inside of the negative plane, and an awful entity of anti-life is exchanged for them. So the individual trying to access the negative plane gets sucked inside of it, and a terrible undead being is released in their place. And that entity is a Nightwalker. They are, in many ways, living embodiments of the negative plane, personifications of anti-life. They roam around the material plane whenever they get there, seeking to bring all life to extinction. They are extremely powerful. You could find them on page 216 of Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. It is a huge undead with a challenge rating of 20. They don't have a high armor class, only 14, with 297 hit points. They have a lot of condition immunities, damage immunities, and damage resistances. All of their abilities and features just scream anti-life. They have something called an annihilating aura, which makes any creature that isn't undead that starts its turn within 30 feet of it have to succeed on a DC 21 Constitution saving throw or take 4d6 necrotic damage, and the Nightwalker gets advantage against attack rolls against that entity until the start of that creature's next turn. They also have a feature called Life Eater, which essentially means that if they kill you, you can't be revived. If you're reduced to 0 hit points, there's no death saves, there's no revivify, you can't be brought back to the material plane by any means other than a wish spell. They just disintegrate your life. They have an attack which deals 5d8 plus 6 necrotic damage and reduces your hit points by that amount. They've got a long-range rechargeable ability called Finger of Doom, which attacks a creature within 300 feet of it and makes it make a wisdom saving throw with a DC 21 or take 4d12 necrotic damage and be frightened and paralyzed until the end of the Nightwalker's next turn. It's just a terrifying being that is trying to annihilate everything that it comes into contact with. And its visual plays into that as well. It essentially looks like a giant shadow bipedal beast with massive horns and long fingers and claws that just drips shadow as it walks, as it tries to annihilate everything that it comes in contact with. So how do you use these things in a story? They're not intelligent. They're not going to be crime bosses. They're not going to be the villain in the sense of being a mastermind or anything like that, but there are ways of using them. I personally love using them in an area in a setting which is torn asunder for some reason. An area where, due to a past war or to a past apocalyptic event, is essentially just a wasteland devoid of life. I love having a being like a Nightwalker just prowling that space as part of the danger of that area. In our setting of Carrick, there's an area that is like this called the War Wastes. And in the War Wastes, there are these things called gashes, where the weave is broken down due to the events which happened there in the past. And if you come in contact with one of these gashes, there's any number of effects that could happen. One of the possible effects, though, is that the person who comes in contact with it is sucked into the negative plane and a Nightwalker takes its place. So Nightwalkers do walk around on the War Wastes. They are absolutely terrifying creatures, and it adds to the complete feeling of devastation. Like, it really makes it feel very post-apocalyptic just to have this terrifying entity in addition to the terrors of the natural environment. It's bad enough to be walking through a Chernobyl-type situation, and it makes it even worse if there's terrifying beings roaming around there with it. It just raises the stakes a little bit. So I like using them in that manner. They can also be used as a plot hook for a rescue mission. Because interestingly, in their lore in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, it talks about this instance where somebody goes to the negative plane and a Nightwalker takes its place on the prime material. Most of the people that end up going to the negative plane, because it is such a terrifying place of anti-life, are just immediately annihilated. However, if somebody's powerful enough, they can actually survive there by warding the death and decay of the negative plane away from them. However, even though these few that can do this are extremely powerful, because you have to be extremely powerful in order to survive on the negative plane, they can't get back out. The only way to exit the negative plane is if somebody lures this Nightwalker back into the negative plane, and you can then take its place again. That's the only way to release the trapped creature. And I think that's a really interesting plot hook, perhaps where a very powerful and well-known mage of a kingdom has been discovered to have been lost into the negative plane, and the party is tasked with tracking this nightwalker, which is going around terrorizing everybody, and the party has to actually figure out a way to trick it back into the negative plane with, as Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes states, by offerings of life for it to devour. And that could be a really interesting story to tell. But even if you don't use them in any of these specific ways, they are just terrifying, awful creatures that will add a lot of suspense and dread to a horror-style encounter. Unless your party is very powerful, trying to sneak around an area where a Nightwalker is going to be like Frodo and Sam trying to sneak around the Nazgul. It's an entity that is just terrifying. You don't understand it. It is completely contrary to everything that you stand for, to everything that lives, and you're just trying to avoid it at all costs. So it's just a great horror monster in that regard as well. But I think that's about enough exploration of the negative plane. Let's head back into the prime material, into the tavern, and grab some refreshment. Alright, in a much friendlier and livelier place than we just were. The plot hook that we're going to be looking at today is, what would you do if there was a royal wedding? This is a very cheerful and happy plot hook rather than the monster that we just discussed. This is an interesting social style adventure hook, which can occur in your particular kingdom or whatever type of governance your setting happens to employ. Whether it be the current monarch wedding someone else, or perhaps a child from each of the kingdoms are getting married to each other. There's many different ways that you could do this, that you could set this up. And depending on the current state in your campaign, you can hook the party into this in a number of different ways. It can just be, especially if they're at lower levels and they don't have much renown yet, it can just be a simple world building plot hook. Especially if it's a situation where people from adjacent kingdoms are getting married and there's perhaps some tensions or some relieving of tensions that are related to this particular union, depending on whether or not there's approval or not of their love. And it can just be a great world-building thing that you can throw in and can act as the starting point for a really interesting tale down the road where a rift is torn between these two kingdoms and now these people are at the center of it, or some other sort of plot hook where this little detail you're seeding is going to come back up at some point in the future. If the party is a little bit further on in their campaign and they have a little bit more renown, perhaps they're tasked with protecting one or both of these particular individuals. Maybe they have to guide a prince or a princess or a king or what have you from one kingdom to the other, whether as a guest or as a party actually in the wedding. Perhaps there's even rumors of an assassination. Perhaps, again, there's disapproval of this particular union. Maybe if the party has gotten involved in the seedy underbelly of the town, then you are tasked to actually stop this union in one way or another. And if the party has gained a lot of renown and they're at higher levels and they've gained favor with a particular kingdom, maybe they're guests at this particular wedding and they happen to be there and witness a particular event. And this gathering together at the royal wedding is a type of scenario which launches into a much larger arc, which gives that larger arc added oomph right at the beginning, because the The circumstance that brought it about was not just a random encounter at a market. It was something that disturbed the very wedding of a member of the royal family. And of course, this type of event doesn't really have to be a royal wedding either. It can be some other sort of royal event or event involving the particular government if it doesn't happen to be a monarchy, perhaps if it's a council or a diarchy or a democracy or something like that. Perhaps it's a particular coronation event of an individual or a retirement of a particularly high-ranking individual. Some sort of event like that the party then gets to interact with and affect in some way. So it's a really versatile plot hook that you can use in a wide variety of ways, and I think is a great place to tell some interesting stories. But I think that's about going to wrap up this episode of Plot Hooks. Thanks to all of you out there in the Plot Hooks family for listening, and thanks from all of us here at Plot Hooks. I'm Samuel. Thanks from Steve, Zach, Dave, Mike, Matt, Becca, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.